Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the virtual faculty spotlight panel during Free Speech Week. Today's panel is an exciting one on the promises and perils of speech in the digital world. We could talk about this all week, let alone in 1 hour, but my promise to you is that we are going to have one sharp people talking up here and me, and we will only stay an hour. So we'll get an hour of an introduction to this exciting topic. My name is Dr. Scott Stroud. I'm an associate professor of communication studies here at University of Texas at Austin. I research many topics in communication, culture, and media ethics. I'm the program director of media ethics at the Center for Media Engagement here in the college. We have a variety of smart academics, researchers from our college on this panel today. I'm excited to hear from them. Let me briefly introduce each of them. And then each will get 5 to 10 minutes to talk about their angle of the exciting and often, stressful topic of free speech in the digital world. And, I can't promise we'll be on one theme except free speech, but I promise you it will be, enlightening, hopefully. And then after each of us has our swing at the topic, we'll open it up for comments from the audience. I believe the webinar format here allows you to type comments and questions at any time during the event. So feel free to use that modality. You will not be interrupting us. And you can see what other people are thinking too. So feel free to type your comments and questions as they come. And then at the end, we'll have some more discussion, perhaps on those points. So joining me today also on this panel is Dr. S. Craig Watkins, who is the Ernest A. Sharp Centennial Professor in the School of Journalism and Media here at UT Austin. He's an internationally recognized expert in media, and he's also the author of 6 books exploring young people's engagement with media and technology. Also on the panel will be Dr. Anita Varma, an assistant professor in the School of Journalism and Media here at UT, and she focuses on media ethics. She also leads the Solidarity Journalism Initiative at the Center for Media Engagement here in the college, where she is a senior faculty research associate. And finally, Dr. Amy Kristen Sanders is joining us. She's a former journalist, a licensed attorney, and associate professor of media law in the School of Journalism and Media here at Moody College. Her research focuses on international and comparative media law and policy, including specific topics such as media freedom, access to information, government transparency, and social media. So with no further ado, let's get to the good stuff, our panelists' views on free speech and what it promises and the perils it offers us in this new digital world we continually create with our social media clicks. And we have no particular order to our presentations, but we have to have an order. So we're going to start first with Dr. Sanders will lead us off, and then Dr. Watkins and Dr. Varma, and then I'll pick up the slack. Dr. Sanders, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dr. Stroud. And it's a pleasure to be here and talk about, one of my real passions, and that's freedom of speech. And of course, the title of the panel, Promises and Perils of Speech in a Digital World, it says a lot. And many days it's hard for me to really decide which of those aspects is winning out. Right? Does the internet offer the possibility for individuals to speak to large audiences at basically no cost? Sure. But that's only for individuals who have access to the internet and the ability to craft their messages in ways that have mass appeal. Right? Does the internet have the potential to create a global discourse on important social issues? Absolutely. But it also has the potential to allow the spread of misinformation and disinformation on a global scale. Right? Does the internet allow people to engage with friends and family from around the world, regardless of where they're physically located? Definitely. But it also, as we've seen in the past 18 months, has the potential to create a profound sense of isolation. But none of this is really new, right? Freedom of speech has always come at a cost of other fundamental values and interests. And it's really up to us, I think, to decide when that cost becomes too much, right? Do we think the cost is too much when our media ecosystem is dominated by only a few large companies? If so, then maybe we should step in with antitrust regulation to ensure the market supports robust competition, right? Do we think the cost is too much when the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation impacts our ability to make informed choices about how we govern ourselves and the political climate in which we live? If so, then maybe it's time that we step in with regulations that discourage the intentional sharing of falsities. Is the cost too much when individuals are targeted with harassment and disparagement based on their race or ethnicity or their religion or gender identity? If it is, then we need to step in with speech regulations that punish targeted hate speech that's designed to injure. But none of these questions should be taken lightly, and neither should the decision to regulate free speech. You know, in the United States, we've long heralded the First Amendment protections of speech and press that prevent the government in nearly every instance of preventing us from speaking. But those very same First Amendment protections still permit post-publication punishment in a lot of instances, right? We don't allow fraud or perjury or defamation or invasions of privacy to go without punishment. For decades, we've trumpeted the First Amendment as creating an environment where free speech flourishes. But this First Amendment exceptionalism disrespects a lot of experiences of Americans who don't feel free to speak or who've been attacked for the opinions that they express. It discounts the approaches that are being taken in other parts of the world to create an environment where respectful and civil discourse can actually flourish. And it even threatens to deteriorate our relationships with our allies and other liberal democracies around the world. Now, don't get me wrong, there's no doubt that autocratic governments around the world are taking advantage of all kinds of laws that purport to criminalize the sharing of disinformation or target criminal activity that takes place on the internet, to shut down dissent, to limit citizens' ability to know what their government and their leaders are doing. All of this despite the promise to all of us that the internet would be a democratizing force for good, right? If you look at any index, the Reporters Without Borders Index, the Freedom House rankings, just to name two, you'll see across the board a global decline in democratic values. Freedom of speech, particularly on the internet, is chief among those values that are declining. My own research in the Middle East since the Arab Spring includes case study after case study where autocratic leaders have used newly enacted laws, often laws that are implemented without any kind of democratic process, to silence their critics, to prevent the sharing of truthful information about government misdeeds, and to limit citizens' ability to engage in peaceful protest. We know the problems, we just haven't figured out all the solutions yet. We know it isn't the free speech free-for-all that exists here in the United States, nor is it the repressive regimes developing throughout the Middle East, North Africa, Eastern Europe, Central and South Asia. The repression that has been empowered by liberal democracies cracking down on free speech and maligning a free and independent press is real. And today's conversation about the promises and perils of free speech is one of many that I think have to take place as we start to sort through policies that promote and protect free speech while acknowledging and addressing the very real harms that result from it today.
All right, thank you, Professor Sanders. A wonderful start. Now, before we go on to Professor Watkins and his take on this, the title was general enough to get all of you smart people on here with your busy research projects, but yes, somehow unite us. For those in the audience, there's a button at the bottom of your Zoom interface. This is Q&A. That's the one you want to hit, and you could type your questions or comments at any moment. And, they'll be kind of stockpiled in that little button or window. All right, Dr. Watkins, if you want, you have the floor.
Sure, thank you, Scott. And thank you, Amy, for those wonderful kind of framing remarks and perspective. I think what I'd like to do is sort of build on what Professor Sanders just shared with us. And it seems to me, and I focus a lot of my research on, just the rise of social media, the different ways in which these technologies have been adopted, and then thinking about the social, ethical, and sort of political implications of just the global spread, if you will, of these technologies. And of course, what we've seen, since I've been looking at this, 10, 15 years now, is just a tremendous growth in terms of spread, tremendous growth in terms of use. And it has raised a number of different questions, ethical questions, political questions, policy questions. And it seems to me, right, when we think about speech in particular and free speech more specifically, again, to Professor Sanders' point, this idea that in some ways, one of the, one of the ways in which this technology was championed, right, was the degree to which it sort of democratized or leveled access to those resources, media resources, communication resources for different voices, right, to participate, if you will, in public discourse, in the public sphere. And of course, what we didn't anticipate with the arrival of these platforms was the proliferation of hate speech, the proliferation of speech that's intended to cause injury, to sow polarization and discontent. And that's really what we're dealing with now. These issues, I think, really began to, they've been swirling, from the very beginning of these technologies. But as they become more broadly diffused, as they become more integrated into our everyday lives or in everyday modes of communication, they're raising a lot of interesting and compelling questions. And I'm thinking, right, a few years ago, if you think about episodes like what happened to, Leslie Jones on Twitter, when she was attacked, racist attacks, sexist attacks. Some of you may be familiar with Gamergate and the ways in which a lot of women who were trying to, find a space, if you will, within the gaming sector and gaming culture were viciously attacked and lives threatened, sexual assault threatened, and all of this happening, right, via highly calibrated, social media, campaigns. And then, just some of the things that I've looked at over the years and talking to Black Lives Matter activists, for example, death threats and other kinds of, racist attacks that have happened on these platforms. I think what has struck, a lot of people and increasingly around the world is the lack of intervention or the inability of platform companies to really be responsive to the concerns that people express about these kinds of calibrated attacks. The idea, right, that you could use these technologies to assault someone in terms of race, assault someone in terms of race and sexuality, just struck us all, right, as sort of improper and certainly something, that could be dealt with either from a technical point of view or from a policy and ethical point of view, and yet, nothing was really done. No legal recourse for any of these people at the time, and certainly no regulatory recourse for people at this time. I think now, as we began to understand these issues and understand both the broad diffusion of social media and these platforms and the sort of urgency of the moment, right, and the degree to which these technologies, these systems have become so central to our lives and how we think about the public sphere and communication, that these are all issues now. We're hearing more about regulation. We're hearing more about the ways in which technology platforms are beginning to be more assertive, if you will, and more creative, using AI and other kinds of ways of detecting and deleting this kinds of speech, deplatforming, right, offenders. And these are all, of course, actions that they only took upon intense media scrutiny, public and political activism, and increasing pressure, right, to be much more responsive, to these kinds of concerns. In some ways, being shamed, if you will, to respond to these conditions. I just want to say something really quickly about solutions, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Varma. Is so I'm always interested now not only in understanding the problem, but also trying to understand, right, what are some solutions and what are different modes of intervention that we might be able to design and implement in order to sort of mitigate the impacts and disparate sort of outcomes associated, with these practices. Some might include, for example, right, just the need for greater literacy. I remember, right, when I started doing this work years ago, when we talked about digital literacy, it was very constrained in terms of how we understood digital and literacy together. And now we understand, right, that it has, widespread implications, including, right, helping to cultivate a public that's more literate in terms of what is acceptable or unacceptable speech, what are the limits and constraints of free speech in an online or digital world. Increasing public pressure, campaigns, as I said earlier, these companies typically only respond to public pressure, public scrutiny from advocates, from political activists, from journalism, from journalists. And so this becomes really important. We're seeing in Europe, right, in certain countries like Germany, for example, attempts to impose, financial penalties, right, for allowing this content to proliferate. Once something is reported, right, if it's not removed within 24 hours, substantial fines might be levied against, technology companies. And so this idea, right, that perhaps if they aren't responsive to the political and ethical concerns, to social justice concerns that many have around these issues, that maybe they may be compelled to respond if there are financial considerations are taking place. And so there are any number of, and then sort of, again, technological solutions, sort of designing AI to detect and to remove content, building teams that are much more responsive to this kind of content, and just creating safer online communities for all of us becomes really important. And maybe we can talk about, some of the challenges that countries like Germany and others have faced, who are far ahead of trying to regulate and deal with these issues in ways that perhaps in this country, we're not quite there yet.
All right, thank you, Professor Watkins. And now, Dr. Varma, you're a third panelist. Feel free to have the floor.
Thank you so much. And many thanks to Dr. Sanders and Dr. Watkins. You would think we planned this because I'll pick up on some of the threads that they just shared. So whenever anybody asks me about free speech, my question is always this: free speech to what end? Are we aiming to protect free speech at all costs, a kind of absolutism, irrespective of the content of the speech and its impact on anyone else? Or are we aiming to protect free speech in the service of a greater good, greater than the individual? So I'll argue for the next few minutes that the promise of free speech is not really an end in itself. Instead, it can help and has helped create conditions for solidarity to advance society towards social justice. Now, before I go too far, let me tell you in very brief terms what I mean by some of those conceptual terms I just used. So solidarity, as I define it, is a commitment to social justice that translates into action. It's not just something you feel, it's something that you do. And social justice means, quite simply, dignity for everyone. When dignity is our intrinsic worth, we don't earn dignity through good actions or fancy achievements or college degrees. Dignity is something we all have by virtue of being human. But just because we all have dignity does not mean that we all live in conditions that respect that dignity. As Professor Watkins just explained, marginalized communities in this country know very well that their dignity is inherent, but institutional arrangements that respect that dignity are very much not guaranteed. Solidarity is often a really incendiary act when you think about it. And that's why I think it offers one of the greatest promises of what free speech can bring about in a digital world. So with free speech protections, we have at best a chance to speak up collectively for change in the direction of social justice. And the powers that be may very much prefer that all of us sit down, quiet down, and acquiesce to conditions imposed from above that may have been created without any kind of representation of people's interests outside of the elite few who stand to benefit the most. But solidarity means we all still get to say no. Some major examples of solidarity that have been protected by free speech in pre-digital eras and in digital eras include social movements, demonstrations, sit-ins, virtual sick-outs, and my research focus, journalism, that stands up and says no to any of us being subjected to inhumane conditions that deny that intrinsic worth. And most importantly, solidarity doesn't just say we're against things as they are, but also gives us a chance to say, here's what we want to change. Here's specifically what we are for. Solidarity in journalism can take the form of opinion pieces, which we could have a whole separate panel about, but the more in-depth examples of solidarity that I've found arise in reporting that amplifies the perspectives of the people who are subjected to these dehumanizing conditions. So instead of just amplifying the president or members of Congress or local officials, this type of reporting starts with people who are living in unjust conditions, such that reporters represent their issues and amplify their calls for concrete change. As you can probably imagine, people with official power might very much prefer that these news outlets focus on officials and not on people impacted. So in that way, you can see how solidarity in journalism becomes an act of defiance that is really astonishing and impressive when you think about the kind of capacity there is for reporters to resist the preferred narratives of people with power, to stand with people subjugated by current conditions, and to do so within the protections of free speech and a free press. So the greatest promise of free speech, I would say, lies in the possibilities for it to protect and foster solidarity that moves us toward the kind of society that the Constitution points us in the direction of imagining, which is all about dignity for everyone, online and offline, and not just those who can afford it, who can sue for it, or those who happen to be fortunate enough to be born into conditions that already respect and uphold their intrinsic humanity. One of the reasons I was in such a hurry to explain how I define solidarity is that the term solidarity gets thrown around in all kinds of ways that are not always what we would want to say is part of the promise of free speech. So Sally Schultz is a philosopher who's described something called parasitical solidarity, which are movements and messages that feed on or appropriate language and logics of solidarity, but do so in the service of advancing social injustice. Now, if a movement online or offline is trying to claim that a group of people lacks humanity, that's certainly not solidarity in the sense that I'm using the term and is not part of the greatest promises of free speech. Ethical freedom has never been about the freedom to subjugate. And while we certainly need guardrails against censorship, and Dr. Sanders introduced us to a few of those, the promises of free speech can only be fulfilled if we also open our eyes to what Dr. Watkins was raising around the dehumanizing ramifications of speech and set guardrails around those too. So I'll wrap up with two final points on thinking about the perils of free speech. And I think the biggest issue comes from defining free speech in individual terms and as an end in itself. So if we limit ourselves to thinking of free speech as a matter of everyone gets to say anything at all that they wish to say, we have, I would suggest, lost the plot. The problem with free speech as an end in itself and as an individual freedom is that it has quickly led to issues like the loudest voices threatening, drowning out, and effectively silencing people who disagree with them. And this is especially terrifying for women and people of color, as well as a range of marginalized groups who increasingly find themselves attacked, threatened, and burdened by powerful people who may use all of their individual free speech tactics to silence dissent, to silence us from speaking our truths on our terms. So this, as Dr. Watkins already laid out, is not some pessimistic possibility of what might happen, but it's unfortunately a problem that's already happening every day and is happening right now as we have this panel. Journalists who report in solidarity, people of marginalized backgrounds, are being silenced, doxxed, and socialized to be afraid of the repercussions of speaking when their speech challenges existing power structures, which should lead us to ask, if free speech is chiefly about individual freedom, who is this individual freedom for, and who is it against? I'll wrap up by paraphrasing Owen Fiss, who once said it may be necessary and even crucial to consider that sometimes we need to limit the volume and reach of some speakers to ensure that more of us can be heard and can speak in solidarity and without fear. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Varma. Wonderful thoughts from the first three presenters, and now I'll throw a wet blanket on it. No, I will give you my thoughts on this, and I like to have pictures because they're worth more than what I usually say. So you should see, I should be sharing my screen. Is that correct? You see a screen share there? Excellent. So I come at this as a philosopher. I'm interested in the philosophy of democracy. What do we mean by democracy, and how does free speech fit into this? And free speech is always an exciting topic, as our panelists know, because it kind of involves inevitably issues of law and issues of ethics. So not everything we're concerned about being uttered on Twitter in passion is illegal, yet we think there's something wrong with it. And there's a lot of stuff that's illegal that's arguable whether we should be censoring that stuff through the force of the state. So law and ethics are always implicated in free speech. And that's why you have a free speech week on so many universities, because it's something that inevitably we have to deal with in a reflective fashion. Now, the reflective fashion I'll deal with it in is start from this kind of starting point. What do we mean by democracy? Democracy, like ethics, is one of those terms a lot of people use. You always want to be a Democrat, unless you're like in Plato's time, and you always want to be ethical. Everyone loves that word, but we often have differences when we get probed about what we mean by these kind of terms. And so, it really was a watershed moment for me when I started looking into the different ways to theorize democracy and seeing that so many of them put these as kind of procedural decision-making strictures or traditions. So the idea that democracy is about who gets to vote, how do you make decisions among those we voted into office. So you got that kind of view. Now that's not unimportant, but that is not the only or probably the most important view of democracy, at least for folks in America, folks in India, these big democracies that are now struggling to get along with each other. So you look to one of the lights I have found very valuable, John Dewey. When he went to China in 1919, 1920, he was called Mr. Science, Mr. Democracy by the thousands of Chinese that came to watch him. And, he wrote this in 1939, so well after that visit. But, he writes a wonderful short essay called Creative Democracy. And, there he really clearly puts something he had gotten at his whole life, the idea that democracy is a way of life, and that it signifies a possession and continual use of certain attitudes towards other people in all of the relations, the communicative interactions in life. Now, Dewey was before Facebook. He was even before Friendster and MySpace, if my dates work. But he was interested in the same problems we're interested in. How do we get along with all of these people we are forced to interact with and form community with in a democratic government? Okay, so the idea, he said in 1939, right? This is a week or two after Germany invaded Poland, which is kind of the official start of World War II. And, this is obviously a time that the world knows there's going to be a lot of death and violence in Europe, and there's going to be probably a lot of death and violence outside of Europe. They saw this happen with World War I. And there Dewey starts talking in this essay that the goal of democracy is to take as far as possible every conflict which arises out of the medium of force and violence, and to try to get to a situation where you treat those who disagree even profoundly with us as those from whom we may learn, and insofar as friends. Now, I don't know about you, but this is not what I think of when I see something I disagree with on Twitter. But this is the ideal of democracy, and he has a point here. You can't get rid of people from your democracy. So how do you form a quality community with people you disagree with now and maybe will agree with in the future? And what's fascinating about this essay too is that, again, it's at the start of what's going to be World War II. And, obviously the Germans are going to be harshly criticized by people like Dewey and, many Americans. But Dewey takes the opportunity not to just hammer on what the Germans are doing or what they might do, but to worry about the larger problem, which is the problem that exists after violence has given way to peace. And that is the idea that the way we interact with others, whether it's intolerance, abuse, calling of names, all of these kind of ways of hurting each other through words that are different from hurting each other through tanks and, air raids at night, are treason to the democratic way of life. For everything which bars freedom and fullness of communication, sets up barriers that divide human beings into sets and cliques, into antagonistic sects and factions, and thereby undermines the democratic way of life. So he's getting at this deep point, which is that even in a community that was acting as one against the Germans, the US, with all of its problems, it's still not where it needs to be when there are divisions between groups. And I doubt you'll see much more unity nowadays than during the wartime. And then the next part of Dewey is, I think, very important. The idea where he says, look, merely legal guarantees of free speech, let's say, are of no avail if in daily life, freedom of communication, the give and take of ideas, etc., is choked by mutual suspicion, by abuse, by fear and hatred. And so, that's the way he thinks that kind of implicit coercion is even more dangerous than open coercion, which, as the example of totalitarian states proves, is effective only when it succeeds in breeding hate, suspicion, and intolerance in the minds of individual human beings. So Dewey, at the start of World War II, a massive amount of overt physical violence that's about to occur, is worried about the problem that confronts every democracy. And I would say, including ours now, with our debates over cancel culture or making consequences happen to people's speeches, or however you want to put this kind of stuff that goes on with doxing or coordinated campaigns of activism, et cetera, canceling speakers, whatever kind of face this presents. It's the same issue of how we use force through speech to limit or enable other people's ability to use force through speech. So I leave you with these three queries about free speech's ethical value to democracy. And I think these underlie the legal debates about protecting free speech in the United States. In the United States, as you know, is absolutely unique. It has no thing in the Constitution like Germany or India about you can't malign the dignity of other groups or religions. Imagine the Broadway plays that would be constrained if those were seriously enforced. So the US has, for better or worse, a very long-standing tradition of legally protecting free speech. And ethically, we put up with a lot of stuff that other people wouldn't put up. But now with the internet, these things are changing, and maybe for the better. But one, free speech could refer to unrestrained speech. But 2 and 3, free speech can be seen as a testing ground for our own democratic habits, namely how we value and interact with those who disagree with us, even those we might judge as hateful on some topic. This is the kind of stuff that I find philosophically interesting about free speech, is that it forces us to confront the fact that in some cases we have to deal with people we find intolerant, people we don't want to make community with, but we're stuck with in physical proximity. And this is why I think free speech and the debates around it will never disappear. These are issues that we cannot resolve that easily. So with that being said, I think all of our presenters have given us different angles on this, kind of roughly cut gem of free speech. And, there are things we left out, undoubtedly, things you want to hear more about. So let's open it up to some of the questions, which I believe some of them are in the chat already. And speakers, if you click on Q&A, you'll see some of these questions. I'll just start us off with one, and anyone and everyone can, answer or interact with each other, the panelists, on these. If you don't want to speak, that's fine. I will not call on you. So again, there's no strict formal procedure for how we deal with these things. Let's start with one from Craig Scott here, the chair of CMS. He says, Amy, thanks for your insights. Your comments make me wonder who gets to decide, or who should get to decide, when the cost of free speech is too much. And I believe this theme was brought up by Dr. Sanders, as well as a lot of other folks, Dr. Varma, Dr. Watkins. This is a concern I think we all have. A lot of the stuff that counts as speech is not the kind of expressive conduct that's helpful for our democracy, we believe. So I think all of us have something to say. Any good models out there that any of us might know of for how best to do this? So I open the floor up to our panelists now.
Well, I'll kick it off by saying that, the attorney in me is always concerned about government interference in freedom of speech, particularly when we're thinking about protecting minority viewpoints, dissenting viewpoints. I think we have to be particularly cautious of permitting too much government interference in determining what is good speech and what is bad speech. Nonetheless, I think that there are lots of other options. Dr. Watkins talked about a number of sort of social options. Of course, the First Amendment doesn't constrain private actors from deplatforming users, from creating guidelines for the communities in which they're allowing people to speak. And there's, quite frankly, nothing to say that we can't establish a private right of action, of legal action, for people who are harmed by hate speech and other kinds of intolerant speech. I think it's something that we've largely shied away from, but it's certainly something worth exploring, thinking about how we allow individuals to seek remedy for speech that has caused them tangible harms. Is there a good model for this yet? I don't think so. I mean, we talked about some of what's going on in Europe with hate speech regulation, but a lot of that relies on the coercive power of the government. And I think there's danger there. It's not to say that the desire isn't good. I'm not sure that's the method I would go for, of having the government step in. Now, there are ways that the government can step in, I think, in terms of promoting the kind of speech that we want. And I think that's someplace that we really haven't taken full advantage of, exploring ways in which, we can incentivize the creation of the kinds of discourse that we want to see happening.
Yeah, it's an interesting, question that Craig Scott has posed, and Amy, I would agree with virtually that you've just noted. So there are many different stakeholders, right, and related to this issue, and I'll focus on one in particular, but there's certainly others. Amy mentioned government. Her comment suggests, right, that there may be other bodies or other entities that may contribute to or participate in how we begin to sort of think about whether it's monitoring, establishing parameters, guidelines, principles that help us to better understand what's at stake here and how to most effectively address it. But I'll focus on one key and obvious stakeholder, and that is, the tech platforms through which these sort of digital forms of speech, take place. And these are obviously issues that they are grappling with, again, as they become more global in scope. And as they've seen their platforms turn into, devices and tools to sow division, polarization, in some cases, to mobilize, genocidal behavior, through certain kinds of speech and information that are spread online. I think we would all recognize that those are activities or behaviors or instances that we would not want to see protected. And yet, there still are these internal discussions and debates within the tech companies about how far they should go in terms of removing, deleting, making these kinds of decisions. Who gets to decide, what's free speech, what's the cost of free speech, what are the limits? Even as recently as within the last year or so, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook has made some public pronouncements that have been kind of puzzling, but yet, for whatever one might think about Zuckerberg and Facebook, are somewhat understandable in terms of trying to understand and grapple with the power of a massive platform like Facebook. And when do you start deciding, whose speech is allowed, what kinds of speech are allowed, whose speech is not allowed, what kind of speech is not allowed, who do you deplatform, who do you censor, who do you remove, who do you delete? And my conversations with folks at Facebook and those who know Facebook, there's all these sort of interesting decisions that happen within the company about this. I think we're learning now that they've been quite reluctant to grapple with highly visible public figures, celebrities, politicians, elected officials, that they've almost sort of allowed them to do and say whatever. And yet when it comes to more marginalized populations, and one specific example that I'm aware of, is within Facebook and my conversations with them, there have been constant complaints, from, let's say, African Americans who felt as though content that they posted, speech that they've engaged in, has been surveilled, policed, deleted, or removed from the platform. And so, it's interesting to see kind of when and where they pick, to make decisions about what they think is appropriate content or content that defies their community standards, and therefore feel that they can remove it without feeling as though they're violating these ideas and notions around free speech. But certainly, high profile examples of individuals, elected officials, presidents, other government leaders, sort of the need to begin to start thinking more, I think, creatively about how to deal with the abuse of that kind of power and authority that it brings in terms of the use of these platforms.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in to add that I firmly agree we may not be comfortable with government deciding. I also think many of us would be kind of uncomfortable with Mark Zuckerberg deciding, as the status quo might suggest that leaves something to be desired, even when there's internal dissent that we've been seeing from the tech companies. And that's where, in terms of model, I would point to a model that has not been realized in practice, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be, which is a deliberative model where we would see stakeholders come together to try to understand competing incentives and strategic desires, and also to try to come to some agreement about what is too much, What's too much for me is likely not what's too much for Mark Zuckerberg. And if we get 50 more people in the room, that will shift. And so likely will all of our understanding. So I think that, to start with the folks who have been most adversely affected, all too often these quote unquote conversations start with folks who have become billionaires from the way that things are set up, instead of pointing our attention to where this has gone wrong.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this conversation and each of your comments. I'm wondering, and this is just kind of a question just to put out there, and feel free to respond, because it's something that I think more and more about. is this community engagement or community stakeholder, component. And so while most of us, I think, understandably so, are reluctant or have concerns about government, right, intervening and making some of these determinations, other mechanisms, right, other stakeholders who we would feel perhaps, quote unquote, more comfortable with, community advisory boards, public comment, are there ways to be much more inclusive in terms of how we understand, what's too much and what are the costs and what is it that we're willing to contend with or put up with, and what is it that we feel as though has sort of exceeded our limits and expectations for free speech. In other words, if it's not government, right, sort of helping to shape the conversation and to maybe help shape a way forward, what are some other mechanisms and other stakeholders who we might see as viable alternatives?
Yeah, these are all great ideas. I mean, that's why I love free speech, because I agree that a lot of the trash I see out there is trash, but then I just pull what little hair I have left out, because you don't want billionaires coming up with these rules. No. Do you want Trump or Biden, whichever one horrifies you, coming up with the Bureau of Correct Speech? No. Do you want stakeholders? Well, it depends on the majority in my community and whether I like them or not. I mean, if it's from the 70-some million that voted for this side, or 70-some million from this side that considers this linguistic thing an act of violence, that kind of, I have worries about that too. I mean, so I think in many ways an intractable problem. And what you're going to do is, solving a problem creates other problems in the worst case. Best case, you solve a problem and the other problems aren't that big. And I see a lot of my friends from one political party fleeing off of social media, and who knows what they're talking about. And I see people pop up at school board meetings that I attend, and they say things that I just find from a different universe. And in many ways, I think democracy is failing in these circumstances, because we are not inhabiting the same community, online or offline even. There's another question here from Dr. Scott that kind of goes along with this, and we can, again, we can minimize it and move on to another question, so we don't have to all respond to it. But if you want to build on something, he said, do the panelists see free speech as more of a contributor to or a solution to polarization or political problems we have in our society now?
I mean, I think that's in some ways the question, right? I mean, it's a paradox in some ways. I think it's a wonderfully phrased question, and at least for me, it helps to sort of strike at the core of what renders this topic, right, so complex, so debatable, right? Is that on the one hand, the ability, right, for people to speak out and to share perspective and to voice their views, to participate, right, in public discourse. We all understand the immense value in that, and when that is an inclusive process, right, it can certainly lead to, I think, some promising outcomes. And yet, right, when certain lines are crossed, or certain forms of speech, let's say hate speech, for example, begin to proliferate and spread and scale, then it begins to suggest, something far more sinister. And yet, how do you how do you balance those kind of polar opposites? I mean, for me, right, I mean, I'm not interested in policing or trying to control speech that I don't agree with politically, right? Or that perhaps isn't consistent with maybe my view of the world. I mean, to me, it's when speech becomes, calibrated to be violent, to provoke injury, harm, polarization, to in some ways, right, degrade public discourse, and to degrade people and populations and stigmatize groups. But I think, at least for me, I think, and for some others, right, that's when the lines are crossed, and when we need to figure out, right, what are the parameters, what are the processes, what are the mechanisms for addressing, that kind of speech. But I mean, good debate and competing perspectives and viewpoints. I think that's what we, in a university setting, right? I think we promote that, and we encourage that and embrace that. And I always tell my students, right, if I'm teaching courses, right, on hot button topics, if it's around race, if it's around inequality, that I never want students to feel as though they have to parrot anything that they hear me say or that they see in the readings, but that this has to be a space, right, that's free and open, where people feel free to disagree, where people feel free to express alternative viewpoints and perspectives. And through that exchange and through that interaction, it's my view, and I think others, that we all grow as a result. And so, I don't see this as necessarily trying to reject or to eliminate speech that we don't necessarily agree with or that doesn't subscribe to our view of the world, but rather, right, that moves into the space of injury, harm, hate, genocide, sexism, racism. Those are the things that I think become, increasingly problematic.
Yeah, I would say, just building on that I would see free speech as a solution for a lot of the challenges of polarization. I would see the selective amplification of speech as a contributor to a lot of the issues we see. So if you imagine someone proposing Facebook today, and they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to have really likely to change policies around political speech and elections, and we won't have a very solid system of content moderation, and everyone can join. We all might say, wait a second, that doesn't sound like a great idea, right? And Facebook has existed for quite a short amount of time. When we think about the history of newspapers, the history of radio, Facebook has been around for a very short amount of time, and yet it's managed to normalize itself so thoroughly, not only Facebook, but massive social media platforms that don't have a solid plan when it comes to addressing the biggest harms that Dr. Watkins was just raising. But I'm not ready to throw out free speech with the bathwater there. I think it's these systems that Maria Ressa has described as behavior modification systems, that they are there to make you upset, to make you engage, not in the sense of having a healthy debate, but in the sense of trolling, having knee-jerk reactions and comments and flame wars. And that's the part where I think that free speech gets used for parasitical ends.
Yeah,
Wow.
even more than that, Dr. Varma, yeah, the idea of like, I just don't flame you. I find out where you work and I screenshot your thing and put it in the worst frame. How could you employ someone that's a horrifying blank like this, racist, sexist, capitalist? I don't know if that'll get you fired yet, but eventually maybe. So yeah, I mean, this is the interesting aspect of this. It's all legal, but it's just awful from the viewpoint of, are we constructively using speech towards democratic ends, or are we just tearing each other down and depriving each other of the ability to tear us down? I mean, Dr. Watkins, back to your statement about free speech and the stuff that we find, that's worrisome. Looking back at John Stuart Mill, my students are always kind of scratching their head, because his main examples are like atheists getting ridiculed because they can't swear in a Bible in court, and all kinds of contumely they face, or whatever he says. And, I say, well, look, we find his things of the day that were outrageous and public opinion piled on it. What are we going to find today that you and I take so seriously on Twitter, that the future is going to be like, they got mad over those 200 characters. So yeah, the topic's just fascinating, and at the end of the day, I think we're going to have to learn to live with false things online and awful things online, mean things, even just full of hate online, and some of that might be, go back to the false stuff. What do we do about anti-vax content, on social media? I hate the fact that we have to sell people on vaccines. On the other hand, if something worries, if every meme that mentions vaccines gets banned by Facebook algorithms, this is going to be, I think, truncating too much speech, even incorrect speech, but truncating speech. I don't know, I'm very conflicted on this important topic. I guess that's my bottom line. Dr. Sanders, you were going to say something there.
I think this is the prime space where we talk about the fact that for decades in the United States, we've trumpeted the values of free speech without talking about the role that free speech should play in society, right? What are our goals by promoting freedom of speech? And I think, instead of thinking about is free speech contributing to polarization, or is it a solution? I like to take the opportunity to really engage with folks to think critically about, why do we value this? Do we really value this because somebody can call somebody else nasty words? No, right? We value this because this is how, as a collective, we have decided it's best to learn the information we need to know to govern ourselves and to coexist together. I think that oftentimes educators forget that really important piece of talking about what is the role of free speech in society. Yes, we all know that it gives us the right to say what we want, but to what means, to what end, what's our goal and our objective? And that's where I think, most people, hopefully, who value little d democratic values wouldn't say, my goal in speaking is to, sow polarization. And it's where I think it's important that we talk to and educate folks about the power of speech and the power of persuasion. And I say that a little bit selfishly because that's what all of us in this virtual room do every day.
Yeah, I mean, you sound just like a journalism professor. We tend to focus speech as important because of its truth conveying faculties and usefulness, and this is obviously an important part of the marketplace of ideas. But what would you all say? I'm a semi-moderator here. What would you all say if someone said, well, half of the value of speech is just being able to express yourself, and if you want to make fun of people, think maybe David Chappelle, or you just want to do art. Art is protected under the First Amendment legally. And, so I mean, these are kind of uses, troll people. Half of the internet is used to be just to mess around with other people without getting seriously attached to what they're doing. I mean, this is like a standing challenge to our, views that I take of free speech, that it's useful for moving us forward. I don't know, what do you all think about those kind of uses that aren't just focused on, let's say, the journalistic conveyance of true information through speech, but, people that just want to mess around with speech?
Thomas Emerson would say that that's one of the ways human beings, we develop our cognitive functions, right? That one of the individual justifications for freedom of expression is self-fulfillment. And is there value to that? Certainly. I mean, you use some examples that we could all agree on, like art and music and poetry and those kinds of creative expressions. But there are always going to be other kinds of uses that some people are going to find offensive or objectionable. It doesn't mean that there's no self-fulfillment value in there necessarily, but it also doesn't mean that that speech isn't hurtful and doesn't take away from other people's other rights in some ways. And that conflict is the difficult area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma, right? Insofar as when we think about speech in these other contexts, I mean, it seems like the rules of engagement, the norms or expectations, may be different. So, what a comedian like Dave Chappelle says, that's generally speaking, I would argue, right, a different context for what a president of a country might say, or an elected official, or a policymaker, or someone in a position of high authority, power and influence. And we know that at times, right, that creatives, artists, musicians, they have deliberately, right, used those domains, used those spaces as a way to mobilize speech, as a way to experiment with speech and space, as a way of provocation, as a way of advocacy, right, as a way of promoting, the rights of the marginalized or the silenced. And so, it's an interesting dilemma, but again, to me, it suggests, right, that also how we think about speech and free speech, and what we should do with those rights, or maybe are context specific, right? And so it's interesting, which is what makes the whole digital realm so important. And I think that was part of our title today of this panel, is to what extent do these issues, right, which obviously, right, have a long-standing history that go way back, right? Philosophers and others have talked about this. Dr. Stroud, you invoked Dewey, who obviously has thought quite deliberatively about these issues. And what, if anything, is sort of unique about, right, this digital moment, and the degree to which these things happen at a greater intensity, at a greater scale, at a speed at which, is in some ways unprecedented, right, in terms of how information, how speech now travels.
Kathleen McElroy raises a question, and maybe we'll end on this. We could get maybe one or two people's reaction, but obviously free speech in the legal context, it takes money to pursue claims of defamation. So she refers to Sandy Hook parents who had the resources to go after Alex Jones for the kind of harassment he started along their course with his the hoax kind of theories of Sandy Hook and the massacre there. And so she brings up the question of what about other folks that lack these recourses? So I don't know what, you all see the question. Maybe we get one or two people's thoughts on this as we conclude.
I mean, this is fundamentally one of the most important access to justice issues that we haven't addressed in this country. I mean, it's not enough to say, oh, well, you can get the ACLU on your side, or you can get the, NAACP on your side, or something like that. I mean, we fundamentally need to think about how is it that we open up a system to provide remedies for people who don't have the financial means, for people who may not have the educational means necessary to utilize the courts. And that's a real challenge, to create these kind of meaningful pathways into the systems of justice. But it's a fundamental issue of equity that we have to start to address. And whether that is, providing government resources for some of these kinds of cases, I don't have the answers to that. I just know that we have to start thinking about what it looks like to give people the tools to empower them to use the various mechanisms of living in a democratic society.
And Dr. Varma, some of your research, the journalist, my reading of it is they should pick up the threads in the defense of some of the more vulnerable people and write in solidarity. Is that part of the answer, perhaps?
Like ESP over Zoom. That's precisely what I was going to say, that there's a role here, right, for journalism to play in amplifying not only the most horrific examples of mass shootings in this country, but also the ones that, unsurprisingly to members of these communities, don't get a lot of attention. Weekends in Philadelphia and Chicago that have record numbers of children, folks who are under the age of 18, murdered by gun violence, that never seem to elicit any kind of public reaction, right? And journalism can offer a springboard for that. That's not to say that every journalistic story receives a tremendous amount of attention, but that it can play a role in amplifying these kinds of concerns. I just wanted to give a very brief local example, which is if you've been following the coverage of the situation in Rosemont, which is a low-income housing area that has had lots of issues with mold, with folks not being able to live in these places and being moved around multiple times without representation. The journalists covering these stories, there's not a big splashy national hook to it, but they continue to cover it. And when I've asked them why, they've all said the same thing, which is that no one is speaking up for these folks. And in a system that is so deeply imperfect that we have one journalist for every 1,000 such stories that could warrant this kind of solidarity, I think that's all the more reason to support your local journalists.
Yes, we can get behind that. Well, I think we're about out of time. I know we could obviously go a lot farther on this. I don't think we're ready to vote on whether we should solve free speech by making Dr. Watkins the judge or Dr. Sanders. But thank you all for joining us. This has been the start to what hopefully is a lot more thinking in class, outside of class, on the internet, maybe Twitter for good. And I put in the chat an event tomorrow, an in-person event that we're holding as part of Free Speech Week here in the Moody College of Communication. It's a debate put on by the debate team. So unlike us verbose professors, these are people that are going to really be focused on a theme and a topic. And there's benefits to both sides of freewheeling talk like we do and focused talk like the debate team will. And they have popcorn. So, I mean, man, I'm going to be there just for that. So that's tomorrow at 7 p.m. in the Dean's Briefing Room on DMC, the Dealey Media Center building floor 5. So it's in person at 7 p.m. I thank everyone out there joining us and the participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you.